You're listening to Grown and Growing with Sonia Hamlin. What's up, y'all? Welcome back to the Grown and Growing podcast. I have to apologize for my audio. I just renovated my office and moved into a new space, and so it sounds a little echoey. Hopefully, I'll be able to do something about that in the near future. But this week on the podcast, our topic is healthy boundaries. And I'm discussing healthy boundaries with Dr. Nicole Monteiro. Dr. Nicole is a clinical psychologist and mental health expert. And I had her on the podcast about a year ago. And the topic of conversation then was around femininity and the soft life. It was one of the most downloaded episodes for that year. She really dropped some gems about softer communication, how Black women particularly can benefit from a soft life and how one can go about getting it. It's a great episode. But this week, we are talking about healthy boundaries. Now, Dr. Nicole has been talking about healthy boundaries for about 10 years. She's written a book. It's called Boundaries to Bliss Blueprint. And she also hosts a private community where women can help hold space for one another. And it's called the Boundaries to Bliss Society. So she's no stranger to this topic. In fact, she's been talking about it for a very long time. So who is this episode for? So I think we all know that we have boundaries, right? Everybody has boundaries in place, but are they healthy boundaries? And that's really the difference of what we're talking about today. If you are stressed out or burnt out, if you still struggle with people pleasing, or if you just have relationships in your life where you want to change the dynamics of those relationships because they're not favorable or they don't serve you any longer, chances are that you have some issues with boundaries, whether your boundaries are weak or they're non-existent, or you need to evolve the type of boundaries that you have in this particular relationship. We get into it all in this episode. So without further ado, let's get into this topic. Welcome back to the podcast, Dr. Nicole. Dr. Nicole, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
I'm glad to have you back. I needed to put the respect on your name because you are a licensed psychologist here, PhD. So I've definitely wanted to put the respect on your name, and I'm glad to have you back because I really enjoyed our conversation last time, and apparently all the listeners did too. It was the number one podcast that I did last time.
Yes.
So there are a lot of people out here who want to or aspire to learn more about femininity and living the soft life. So thank you for that, and thank you for coming back. So
You're welcome.
This time, the conversation is a little different. We're talking about boundaries.
And
I wanted to talk about it because I do feel like boundaries are sort of like a buzzword, right? Everybody's have them and reinforce them. But I don't know if everybody knows how to do that. It's a hard thing to do. So why don't we start off our conversation by you explaining, what you think boundaries are. What are they?
Yeah. No, I'm so glad to be back to talk about this because it's such an important issue. And it's interesting to hear it as a buzzword because I've been talking about boundaries for more than a decade. And for the past 3 years, I've been running something called a Boundaries to Bliss bootcamp. So my platform really started off around boundaries. And then, I've always been into soft life, but my primary sort of focus has been boundaries and how boundaries are the key to more fulfillment in our relationships and more balance in our professional lives and in other areas. And so, but you're right, whenever something becomes very popular, sometimes what gets lost is what it actually is and how you actually enact it. So boundaries, I think of them as like just simply a limit, right? A way of demarcating. And so why that's so important for us is that in our relationships, as humans, we need connection, but we also need separation. We need both. And boundaries, I think of them as a system of yeses and nos that help us to define what's important to us, help other people to understand how to treat us, what's important to us. And so it's a way of helping us to better know who we are, like our identity, but also to better relate to people. And so I don't think of it as like a one and done, but it's literally like a whole system of how to relate to people, what you're saying yes to, what is the no-go zone,
Right.
And how you want to be regarded and treated.
Yeah, and I think generally people have boundaries and maybe they don't call them that. They have them, and usually it's not until something is out of whack, like in your life, that it really becomes apparent that you need a boundary, or maybe you've done some growing in your life and you didn't realize that you could have a boundary there or with a certain person. So if you never had boundaries, and I like to talk about them, like you said, in relations to people, like, right, like where do you put people in your life? And so if you've never had a boundary with someone around a certain thing or just at all, right, how do you go about setting a boundary, like if you've never had one?
Yeah, so I prefer to think of them like we all have boundaries. Boundaries are just a part of being human, but it's about healthy boundaries and balanced boundaries. And so what typically has happened is most people at some point in a relationship that's unhealthy or dysfunctional or not working for them recognize that part of the problem is they haven't had healthy boundaries in that relationship. So, and I think sometimes the impulse is to just be like, well, tell them no. Like a boundary is saying no, but actually boundaries is a system of yeses and nos. And so one place to start is to actually reflect on what's important to you in this relationship. What has been happening that you suddenly wake up and you feel a way like it's not working? Has it been that your boundaries are too loose, meaning people can walk all over you, you're not respected, people they exploit you or they do what's good for them and don't consider you? That's an indication of boundaries that are too loose. Now, on the other hand, what people don't think about is sometimes our boundaries are too rigid. Yes or no, 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 that's it. Like there's no flexibility. That's equally as problematic because it doesn't allow people to get close to you. But I think a lot of what we hear people talking about is like the too loose boundaries. And so before you start, quote, setting them, you have to understand what is the problem. So is the problem that you're feeling resentful because you're always saying yes, even when you don't want to? Is the problem that you say no, but it's not respected and people still keep, quote, crossing your boundaries or doing what they want to do? And so once you decide or discover or understand what the issue is, what the core problem is and how it's making you feel, that's kind of the final step is like, what is the course of action? So I don't think we can like jump to like what to do before we kind of diagnose the problem.
Yeah. And it's
Yeah.
interesting that the feelings will show up first, the feeling of resentment, the feeling of
Yes.
like, maybe you feel underappreciated, or maybe you feel you like not valued. Like those feelings will show up first. And then I'm hearing you say you need to investigate like what is actually causing causing you to feel that way. And is it a boundary? Is it always boundaries? It's not. I guess it can't be. You have to go through that process to see if it's boundaries or if it's you being sensitive or if it's stemming from another place. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, because I orient around boundaries, I think it usually
It's
is
usually a
somehow
boundary.
related to boundary. Yeah. Because even the idea of being overly sensitive, why are you overly sensitive? Have you not been respected to the point where like you haven't communicated, so you feel you get like you're hyper aware of being disrespected? Like it usually goes back to some way that the boundaries have been confused. either for
Right.
you or the person, or you haven't communicated them. And another way that they show up is through our bodies. Like long time, sort of like a chronic state of not having healthy boundaries can often show up as like illness,
Right.
as chronic disease, as doing too much, getting burnt out, not
Right.
knowing how to take things off your plate. Like it always kind of comes back to you somehow being distressed, either physically or emotionally or both.
Yeah. And with the example you use, you're saying like if that person is overly oversensitive or super sensitive, I think
Mhm.
people just feel like they're born that way. I'm just a sensitive person and this
Mhm.
thing happened. But you're saying if you think about it long enough, or if you work with somebody to help you, it's probably can be traced back to a lack of boundaries, and it's just not a personality. I think people like make things personality traits when they're rooted in something else.
Else. Well, I would say uh, there is a thing as temperament, and
Mhm.
there are people that are highly sensitive, like they are highly perceptive to like
Okay.
stimulation, and so that is a thing.
Right.
I think what happens is that label becomes negative because, and especially I'll say like for Black women and women of color, it's like it kind of relates to soft life. Like you're expected to be hard, nothing bothers you,
Right.
girl, be strong. So then a person who expresses like their emotionality or being more sensitive, it can be looked down upon. And then that can become like an identity thing. But some
Mhm.
people are actually more sensitive
Sensitive.
than others. But it's just a thing. It's not good or bad.
Okay.
Mhm.
So when people start to to have boundaries and assess like whether they need them, if they need to apply them, what um how can they do that in a way that they can do it and be kind, and they can do it and be compassionate, or because I think when people sometimes if people think about boundaries, especially with people they love, right? If it's a
Mhm.
boundary around a person that they love, that it could seem mean, or it could seem like you don't want to be around that person, or there's something how can you do that in a way that's still where kindness and compassion is still kind of at the forefront?
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a great question. I think a lot of times when people don't have healthy boundaries, they actually lack kindness and compassion for themselves. And they tend to get caught up in a pattern of people pleasing. And so it can feel scary to feel like they're going to withdraw that. But I think if you start to center yourself more that boundaries are healthy for you as a
Mhm.
person, boundaries are actually going to be better for the healthy relationships or the relationships that have the potential to be healthy. For abusive relationships, yeah, that person that you're setting healthy boundaries with probably will get upset. They might withdraw, but that's just a sign that that wasn't a relationship that was going to be reciprocal, right?
Right.
So the kindness and compassion, I would say first and foremost, apply it to yourself. You
Mm.
have the right to um, to have things you want or don't want. You have the right to not have to please someone in order to have like just wholeheartedly please them, that that's the only basis of your relationship. You have the right to do what's good for you and let that be the barometer versus like only if it's good for somebody else.
Mhm.
So the kindness and compassion has to start with yourself.
Mm.
And then I think once you understand that boundaries will help relationships that are supposed to be in your life,
Mm.
and they
That's
will
the key.
help fall off. They will
Yeah.
help, what is it, get shed relationships that should not be in your life.
Mm. That's good. That's a good one. Um, so when a person is setting a boundary, right? I think
Mhm.
another thing that's confusing about boundaries is you set a boundary. A person, the boundary is what is based on what you would do and not what the other person would do, right? So can you explain like because you can't control other
Mhm.
people, right? You can
Mhm.
put a
Mhm.
boundary, but you can't make them do it. So can you explain why a boundary is more about you than about the other person? Or do you even see
Yeah,
it that way? Okay.
that's a great point. I do see it that way, in that a boundary is not an ultimatum. A boundary is not a means of controlling someone. It is a communication of what is important to you and what you're willing to, tolerate or be a part of. And so if you were to tell someone, like on a basic level, because I talk to my kids about boundaries, it's body boundaries, physical
Mhm.
boundaries. And if you tell someone you don't like a certain thing, they're touching you or they're doing something, and you say, no, I don't want that, don't do that. I don't want you to do that. And they continue to do it, then it does fall back on you. What is the consequence? Is it
Right.
that, like for my kids, it's like, no, you need to tell somebody, you need to tell an adult. But for us as adults, it's like, okay, do I allow this person back into my life or back into my space if they've made it clear that they're not willing to respect my boundaries?
Mhm.
So you can't control them, but you can control your actions.
Right.
And with, like you said before, with family members, it might be tough conversations. Um, it seems like I only hear from you when you need something. I'm not in a position right now to give you that, or to whatever. Usually it's money, right?
Mhm.
Let's just be
Right.
real.
Hmm.
You only call me when you need money. I cannot do that. It doesn't mean I don't care about you, but I can't give you any money.
Yeah.
And the person might get mad, but that's on them.
Yeah. I feel like this conversation will partner well with the soft life um conversation we had, because there is a way to do that where you don't
Mhm.
get upset, and if they do get upset, it's because they don't want to respect your boundary because it
Yeah.
inconveniences them in a certain way. But there is just your example. I feel like you are the epitome of soft communication. I'm like, do we all have to go get a PhD to have that?
Just get married and try to make sure your marriage is harmonious, and you will decide to communicate softly.
Yes, every time I see you on my feed, it is a reminder to myself to be softer, that it is
Yes.
okay. It is okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, just the way you delivered that is great, because again, the boundary is there for you. It's for you to obtain peace in your life. It's for
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
to be happy. And so, it's you don't have to say it in a mean way or
Yeah.
anything like that. So when you talk about rigid boundaries, um, why do people have rigid boundaries, and why don't we talk about that more? Like a rigid boundary is always saying no, or did a rigid boundary, do people put them into place because if it's if they say no to everything, then they don't have to. Like, what's behind a rigid boundary?
Like almost like I don't have to think about it. Let me
Right.
just do a blanket. Yeah. I think, yeah, we don't talk about it because we are more in tune with like the people pleasing and all that stuff.
Mhm.
Rigid boundaries are basically it's a form of self-protection. Like I think people pleasing and loose boundaries are self-protection because you're trying to avoid conflict and rejection and all like that. Rigid boundaries are when you are trying to self-protect so much, like you're literally creating a barrier.
Mhm.
So either you've been hurt before, you have a fear of being hurt, not so much rejection, but like hurt, or it could be rejection too. And so you're saying, I'm not going to let anybody, like I have a 6 foot pole all around me. And that is a problem because you never have true intimacy. And I'm not even talking about like romantic, just
Right.
like
Connection.
friendship, yeah, connection yeah, exactly. And so it's almost as if you're saying, you ever, like, how when you go to a restaurant, like say if you went to fast food, it is what it is. You can't say, oh, I don't want the pickles, I want mustard, I don't. It's like,
Right.
no, they just are like
It's how
robots,
they
they
do it.
punch in.
Right.
Yeah, you can't, they get mad if you, that's rigid, right?
Hmm.
But relationships can't work with that. So generally, I don't have friends calling me every day to say 3 in the morning, can you take me to the airport?
Right.
I just don't like, I haven't said that out loud, but like the way I
Yes.
operate, y'all know, right?
That
But
should
that
be
doesn't mean,
known. Yes. Who's doing that? Who's doing that?
yes, right? But there, not to
Yeah.
say I would never do that,
Mm-hmm.
right? There may be a time where I would do that. So I think it's important to be careful of these hard and fast rules. Like,
Mm.
of course, when it comes to your safety and, you know, or even when people say, I don't loan friends money. Okay, I don't typically go around doing that, but
Yeah.
that doesn't mean I'm never going to do it. So
Mm-hmm.
when your boundaries are too rigid, it's like you don't even have a case by case basis. You're
Right.
just like, almost like you said, you don't want to think about it. So you just come up with the rule, and it's just too, I mean, I think we could all relate to having related to someone like that where,
Mm-hmm.
nope, it is what it is. And you're like, okay, like,
All right.
and you, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, I guess it works, right? Because you end up turning around and walking away, and
Right.
that's
And that's
that.
it. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So
But they can't connect. Mm-hmm.
yeah. So related to that, when you have how do you know when it's time to evolve your boundary? Like if
Yeah.
you've had a boundary and what are some signs that it's not working? And maybe it's time for you to evolve that boundary that you
Yeah.
set.
Yeah. So a lot of times, there's three things that I notice with people if they're unbalanced with their
Mhm.
boundaries. They feel um, they're exhausted and tired, like they just never have enough energy. It's like, oh God, and it's not a physical, it's not a health thing per se. Like they're just always stretched thin, overwhelmed. You know, nothing is ever stable. They have emotions, particularly around resentment.
Mhm.
You know, anger isn't necessarily bad, but if you're always in a state of anger, resentment is usually not healthy, right?
Right.
So you're resentful, you're seething, you know, you have kind of like a passive aggressive, like you don't want to say no, but people could feel that energy like, okay, she's not feeling too good.
Right.
And then you also never have enough resources, right? Like you're always broke. There's things you want to do, but you can't do them because it's not that it's only a money thing, but typically people without healthy boundaries tend to squander their energy
Hmm.
resources, their emotional resources, their material resources because they're afraid to
Yeah.
say no.
Hmm.
So
And I've never
you're
thought about
tired,
that.
you're resentful, yeah,
And you
and you're
broke.
yeah. And I'm talking about like when we're grown, you know what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
Yeah,
Like
for sure.
I get right, like there's a certain stability you should be thriving for. I mean, you
Yeah.
should be striving for.
Hmm.
So
That's
yeah.
so you mentioned resentment. How much
Mhm.
resentment is something I'm always curious about
Mm,
because it is something that I've thought about a lot in my own
mhm,
personal relationships and
mhm,
um for me resentment is probably one of the biggest things that I feel like deteriorates a relationship. And I always want to, I'm going to ask you because you're a psych. I always
that
wanted
is
to
so
know
true.
how do you, is resentment more a, it's an unresolved, what is it related to? Like, is it,
Mhm.
because on the outside, it looks like I am upset with this person because they're doing something that I want to do. And is that
Mm.
what it is? Like,
Kind of like envy,
yeah, like
or you're
envy,
doing
or
something I want to
I
do.
can't do it, or something that you're doing prevents me from doing what I really
Mm.
want to do. Is resentment more
Yeah.
about you, or is it about the other person? I'm just curious.
Yes, it's all about you
Oh,
because it's usually a result of not communicating a need or a boundary or a feeling or something. So it usually results from doing things just on a basic, simple level, doing things over and over that you don't want to do.
mm-hmm,
If I, like, for example, if say in a marriage, you guys say, I'm signing the kids up for whatever, soccer or something like that.
right.
And you all decide, okay, you assume we're going to split some days he
Mm-hmm,
takes them, some days I take them. You it and that ends up it's never a split. You're always taking them. you feel the burden of that, you're exhausted, you don't feel good about it, you're resentful, but the resentment comes because you never communicated it, but yet you're
Right.
still taking them each and every day against your what you want to do.
Right.
So the resentment is like the lack of expressing and coming and resolving whatever the
The
conflict or
issue is.
underlying issue is.
It's funny because that it all goes back to
The bus soccer example.
yes. It always goes back to the same thing. So I also want to ask about like when people when they come to you and they're in your program, what do people struggle with the most? Like what mistakes do they make when they're trying to enforce their boundaries that they set for themselves or establish new ones? What are
Mm-hmm.
mistakes that people generally or pitfalls that people generally fall into?
It usually comes down to communication.
Okay.
Being afraid to speak up and communicate what they need because they are afraid of conflict or they feel they don't have the skills, so they don't know how to approach difficult conversations,
Mm-hmm.
or there's some fear around communication.
Right.
Or a lot of times what I'll see with some women is over communication where you and it's like, well, how can I
I
over
was about to say, what
communicate?
is that? How do you over
It's like
communicate? Is it
you're
nagging?
basically it could be that, or you're explaining too much. You're
Okay.
over like instead of just saying like, I don't like this. I can no longer do this. It's not about you. It's me. Like, this is my boundary or whatever. You're like going on and on. It's like you're insecure. So you're over explaining, over proving why. When
Okay.
a boundary doesn't require that, it requires stating a need or stating a limitation or whatever and leaving it at that.
Hmm.
So people either fear conflict or communication, or they over communicate. So then the boundary gets lost in all the words, and the person's like, okay, like what?
Right. What
So
do you
what do
want
you
me to
want?
do? What is
Exactly.
Yeah. So we talked about boundaries with other people and the people in your
Mhm.
life. How does one incorporate boundaries for themselves? Like what does that look like if I'm evaluating my boundaries that I have for myself? What does that look
Yeah.
like?
Yeah. That is a great question because I think that's one of the most important boundaries that we have to have. And sometimes people dishonor our boundaries because they notice we don't have boundaries we don't respect ourselves. So it's
Mhm.
like when we don't uh, follow through with things that we say are important to us or that we want or that we desire,
Mhm.
or if we don't treat ourselves with kindness, right? Where I think of negative self talk and self criticism and harsh self judgment as a lack of boundaries. Because if somebody
Wow.
else were doing that to you,
Hmm.
how would you feel? But then we're doing it to ourselves sometimes.
Right. I feel like it's harder to reinforce a boundary with yourself because if you put a boundary in with somebody you know or somebody in your life,
Hmm.
the boundary is okay, when you do this, this is how I feel. Can you
Hmm.
not do that? And then they do it, then you can say, okay, well, I'm not going to come over anymore, or I'm not
Hmm.
going to do this.
Yeah.
When it's with yourself, I feel like we do this thing where we kind of like negotiate or explain like why, like there's a reason why I didn't do that. I didn't do it because this, and this. And because it's just you, who's going to check you on that? Like who's going to say, oh,
Yeah.
you know what? That's actually not right. You could have done this. But I just feel like it's so easy to let yourself off the hook when you're doing
Yeah.
a boundary for yourself. So is that when first of all, how do you do that? Like, can you check yourself? Or
Yeah.
do you need a
An
therapist,
accountability
a
Yeah.
partner? Yeah.
Yeah, I think you need someone, it can be helpful, but like the way you start is to understand what your values are. When you start to live a value-driven
Mm,
life where you come back to what is going to align with what I value. And then you can start to evaluate certain decisions. I say I value health and well-being, yet I never put any care into what I eat. I never move my body for exercise. I stay up late and wake up early, never get sleep. Like, are those behaviors in alignment with what I say I value? So
Mhm.
sometimes you have to know what like I have people in my programs, um we do a whole value and self mission exercise and mission statement, like who you are, what you want for yourself. And then you can start to
Nice.
determine what your behaviors are going to align with that. And
Yeah.
you're like, I'm saying I'm into health and well being, yet, like, this is my fifth day eating McDonald's. Oh no,
Yeah.
I had to do something different.
And I was gonna say, I don't think that people like I've never sat down and said, wow, what are my boundaries? I mean, what are my values? What do I
Mm-hmm.
value in life? And I think we think about it like very passively. Or it's like, yeah,
Mm.
I know what my values are, but I've never really sat down and thought about it, wrote them down, and then not challenge myself to live up to them, but to see if I even live up to it, right? Because I
Yeah,
feel like I'm gonna write down what I think my values are, and then you go out and you compare it to your life, and it's not they don't match, right? And so
yeah,
there's this level. I feel like there's this level of self-awareness that you have to have, and
that you have to develop. Yeah.
accountability partner is great. A group like yours is great.
Uh-huh.
Because when do you have time to sit down and really think about your values unless you carve that time out and be
Mm-hmm.
intentional about it?
Yeah, because, and you're right, you have to, because when I've determined at this stage in my life, and it's something you do, at different times, it's not just the one and done, but
Right.
like what I value most is well-being, balance, spending time with my family,
Mhm.
eating good meals, making sure that my kids and my husband and myself feel um, well taken care of and cared for, then that drives a lot of my decisions.
Yes.
So in my practice, I used to see clients in the evenings. I don't do that anymore.
Hmm.
I used to, when people would say, "Oh, can you be on this board or review this article?" And so I used to do a lot of that. I don't do that, and I'm very conscientious, because if all of those things take away from those core things I want, then I have to say no.
Yeah. I was gonna say when you were describing that, I feel like when you're listing out the things that you value, it makes
Mhm.
making decisions so much easier because you kind of have a short list to compare it to. And you also,
Yeah,
in a lot of ways, I guess, have a script too. Like, you know what? I really want to do this,
yeah,
but time with my family is very important to me, and I cannot. Goodbye.
yeah,
Goodbye.
yeah. And it kind of relates to what you said, which is earlier. You said, "How do you do it so you don't feel mean?"
Hmm.
I think having a script is important, and you don't have to over explain. It's just like, oh, that sounds like it would be great, but I'm going to decline,
Hmm.
right? No, I'm not able to go. It doesn't fit with my schedule.
Yeah.
And then if you want, depending on the person, you can say, no, I have to spend time with my family. But you can simply just say, oh, that sounds great. Thanks for the invitation. I won't be able to go.
Yeah. It's great. I feel like I need to work on it because I wanted to finish your sentence. Like when you
What
said,
did you want to
"Oh,
say?
oh, that's great," but no, thank you. I was gonna say
Well,
like because I gotta
mm-hmm,
do, like that need
mm-hmm.
to explain is it's heavy in me because I was like, oh,
Yeah.
I want to finish that sentence for her. It can be a hard stop, and you were very pleasant in doing it. That's why I feel like you're a great example of soft life because you give examples.
Yeah.
And feeling comfortable with the period, like feeling comfortable putting a period after no thank you that's a
Yeah.
huge step because you feel like you want to explain, and I feel like people
Mm-hmm.
expect you to explain, right? They
Yeah, they
expect you to
expect it.
say, well, why not? Well, why can't I? Because when you
Yeah.
don't give them more, then they can't come up with a reason to
Well,
combat
can't you just
you.
do it? Your kids get
Yes.
out at 4. Well, then come at 5 or
Then you're not
something like that.
negotiating. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
that's good. I don't even have to tell them. Just say no.
Yeah, you don't. And it's the tone of voice, because people can explain, so they could do the opposite where they give all the explanation, but it's so rough. So it still doesn't even feel good. It's like, well, like, I'm just like, oh gosh. So if you use the right tone, then you don't have to, then maybe that can help you feel better about like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
I'm really not trying to be mean. I'm just trying to protect my peace.
Protect your peace. Because that's
Yes.
ultimately just to bring us back to the boundary conversation. I mean, let's talk about the benefits of having boundaries. One is not having to explain yourself, not having to
Yes.
give reasons, having peace in your life. What else would you add to that?
More time for what you
Yeah.
want to do
Mm-hmm.
because you like not having boundaries, it does suck up your time because you're usually a lot of it is running around doing stuff for people. More self-respect. Like I got to the point where like I'm grown, y'all. Like that's
Yeah.
why all the explaining and the what they're gonna think, it's like, y'all, I'm
It's
grown. I've
exhausting.
been to a yeah, I can't, I'm not doing it.
Right.
So the peace, yeah, the peace is like you feel good. You spend your time doing the things that you want to do versus
Mm-hmm.
what other people want you to do.
Right.
Yeah, so yeah, peace and you have time. It can even affect your health.
Right.
Like because how many of us say we don't have time to exercise?
Right.
But then what are we doing? It's like something that sometimes is stuff that we didn't want to do
Right.
in the first place.
Mm-hmm. There's definitely an intentionality. It's like, so you can't setting healthy boundaries, as you described them,
Mm-hmm.
healthy boundaries, it takes thought, it takes intention, it takes practice. Like
Yes,
it definitely
yes,
takes practice for you to be able to have them long term, right? Because I feel like,
yeah,
with life can come at you fast. There are a lot of things happening. It's easy to let your boundaries slip, particularly with yourself,
yes.
right? Like because there's so many things. You're so busy, particularly if you're still um, in the phase of your life where you're raising kids. It can be
Mm-hmm.
really it can be really easy to let your boundaries slip with yourself and with your family.
Yeah,
You know what? With your kids, you brought up boundaries with your
yes,
kids. That's
you
another
have
important
to.
relationship that I feel like your kids are really close to you. You really love them. I feel like they also challenge your boundaries a lot as
Yes,
well.
they're going to, that's the nature of their being. Like they have
Mm-hmm.
to push the boundaries. And you kind of have to, like, I think a lot of boundaries is allowing yourself to sit in the discomfort.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, we don't want to disappoint our kids, but that's also what helps them to grow. And so it might be a time like, Mommy, I want this. I understand. We're not doing that. No, we're not able to do that today. Nope, not doing it today.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's like literally allowing yourself the discomfort. And you might feel a little guilty. It's okay.
Right.
They'll be okay. You're not killing it. That's what you have to know. You're not killing anyone with your boundaries.
Mm.
Even the most craziest family member that's getting on your
Yeah.
nerves, sometimes a boundary is a lack of, is not responding to them. It
Right.
doesn't always have to be like, I'm just letting you know. They'll get the picture. Sometimes you could just like fade to black, not
Right.
be as involved. And I think sometimes that can be a communication.
Yeah, and they will get it, and they will understand. Yeah, I think like you said about guilt and shame, and like I think people will try to shame, especially family members,
Mm,
will want to shame you for trying to reinforce boundaries. And I definitely think having like you said, an accountability partner, a
yeah.
spouse who understands you and can support you, a
Hmm.
therapist who can, help you, work through the difficulties of that is super important. So,
Yeah, yeah. And it's okay to, it's not easy, especially with family members. I don't want to sit here and make it seem like just do this, this, and this. Like it can be difficult because it's usually a pattern, like it's a long-standing pattern, especially with family.
mhm,
And it can get a little bit dicey and difficult because some people might throw a tantrum, an emotional tantrum
right,
when you start to establish boundaries. But if you understand that that's just part of the process. I made this video where I was like, the stages of setting boundaries. At first, you're all eager, right? Yes. Then you do it and you get rejected, and you're like, oh no. Then you do it more, And then you
Yeah.
start getting mad, like, oh, you're going to respect my boundaries. And then finally, you just get to a peaceful place, like, these are my boundaries, whether or not they're validated by you or not. So
Mhm.
it is a process. Give yourself some grace, and, all of those family members who don't want to respect them, then
Right.
let them do their work. Like, don't be too caught up in how the other person responds.
Right.
Focus more on yourself.
Right. And I think that's important. Like, remember, the boundary is what you're going to do. And so you always have the choice of, hopefully, like you said, with family, it is difficult, but you do have the choice of, trying to remove yourself from that situation. And I think people, in the way we were raised and with our families,
Mm,
sometimes that's boundaries are really crazy because we were raised to always respect your elders and always,
hmm.
that's just the way that person is, or just that's the way that
Yeah.
person is. And they don't have to change. You have to change to be able to deal with
Yeah.
them. So,
Yeah. Yeah. That is so true. Yeah. So nobody needs to understand healthy boundaries. I won't say nobody, but Black women definitely
mhm.
need to understand and incorporate healthy boundaries for themselves. And
For
especially
sure.
with Black women being, is all this talk about overworked, underpaid, all this stuff. And it's like, no one's going to change that if you don't start changing it yourself.
Right,
No,
right.
the white horse or whatever, the brigade is not coming. And if you
Mhm.
don't start to really evaluate the boundaries and what you allow, if you're burnt out, you have to acknowledge you play a part in that,
Right. Yeah.
in terms of what you allow.
And I think particularly when it comes to work, I find that, I mean, it may be because I'm in an environment that is really good, and I've been there
Mm-hmm.
for a long time. The boundary, it's not as bad as when you put it into place, it's not as bad as you thought.
You thought it was gonna.
Yeah, it's not as bad. Like you say, I'm not
Mm-hmm.
answering emails over the weekend. The world does not fall apart. In fact,
There.
somebody's probably waiting for you to say that, and that gives somebody else permission to say that,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then
Yeah.
everybody can stop answering emails and let that one crazy person who wants to send emails on Saturday night just wait till Monday. So it's never, I
Yeah.
feel like sometimes we build it up in our head to be this big thing, and it doesn't have to be. Um,
Yes.
so
Yes. That is a key reminder that it's more of a buildup. And
yeah.
once you start communicating, you'll recognize that a lot of people are going to be on board, or it's not going to be this huge blowout or,
Mhm.
rejection or horrible thing that you've built up.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Nicole. So tell
You
us a
are
little
so
bit
welcome.
where we can find you, a little bit about your Boundaries to Bliss program
Mhm.
or other programs you may have for, I want to say women, but for people, or is it
Yes,
women,
yes,
for women?
women. So my
Okay.
coaching programs, you can find me at Dr. Nicole Monteiro, Monteiro.com. I have an inner circle membership that's called the Boundaries to Bliss Society. And that is for women who want to be able to have a supportive environment where they work on healthy boundaries, they work on their feminine energy and being able to live out a soft life and having fulfilling relationships. And that includes communication. So they're all interconnected because
Mhm.
usually when something isn't right in our relationships, it relates to our boundaries, which then affects our soft life and blah, blah, blah. So that is my Inner Circle membership program. You can find out about it there. I have a book called The Boundaries to Bliss Blueprint. So, yes, Boundaries to Bliss, I have that trademark because I
Nice.
truly believe that healthy boundaries lead to bliss. And so I have a relationship book called The Boundaries to Bliss Blueprint. You can find it there on the website as well. And if you like social media, you can find me at I am Dr. Nicole. Reach out. Don't hesitate to reach out. We have a group of really supportive women who have found this community to be so helpful because what they have found is what you've alluded to, like when they're trying to do their soft life, healthy boundaries, femininity journey, they get a lot of pushback. So
Mhm.
they need a supportive environment of like-minded women.
Yeah, it's not going to be easy at first. So having a support group and having especially like-minded women who want what you want is always a plus. So
Yes, yes,
thank
yes.
you. And I will have all of that linked in our show notes. So so you
Okay.
can easily find you. So thank you so much for coming. It's
Okay.
always such a pleasure. And let me take some bass out of my voice. It's always such a pleasure.
Uh, no, it's your voice
I'm
is
just
your
kidding.
voice. It's great.
I'm just kidding. It's always great to have you. And I hope you have
Okay.
a great night. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much.